Okay, like we've been asking all along, do we have facts or do we have evidence? Can we prove the things that we're talking about? Let's say, for instance, and I'm just going to use Nathan as an example and pick on him because he's not here. Let's say that we said that Nathan was a good person. Would you have facts for sure unless you followed him around every minute of the day, 24/7, for like pretty much the rest of his life? No, because as soon as you don't see him, you don't know what Nathan's doing. Maybe he's not a good person and he's hiding it. So just because you have a casual observation doesn't make a difference. Doesn't prove anything. But what we have is evidence, because at various different times for the last few years that we've known him, he's not done anything that we know of that's been too serious. All right? Everybody's got a good opinion of him. So over time, we get enough of these evidential type things, individual little facts about him, that we can make an assumption that he's a pretty good guy. We like him. All right? We accumulate many pieces of evidence that can be individually facts to build a case of something that we believe. Facts and evidence, then, are sometimes thought to be exactly the same thing, but strictly speaking, they're actually a little bit different than each other. A fact is a truth that can be proven. Evidence is something that points in a direction. Evidence has to be accepted, and the direction that it points must be evaluated. Evidence can lead to proof beyond doubt, as they say it in the courtroom, but then again, evidence can also be swayed by bias and prejudice. Therefore, evidence that leads to a strong belief can be relied upon only if it is presented by someone that is honest, and secondly, then considered by someone that is looking for the truth. You always have to keep that in mind, even when you're talking to someone that may or may not believe that the Bible is true or that there's a God. It applies in a lot of different situations. And isn't that kind of what Jesus was trying to say when he said that I am the way, the truth, and the life? In John chapter 14, he said, consider the evidence. It points in my direction. Adolf Hitler once said, what good fortune for government that people do not think. And then he also said, make the lie big, keep it simple, keep saying it, and eventually they will believe it. I think that the devil uses that kind of tactic every day, and he is in the apologetics field that we're talking about. Nowhere is there more evidence that points in directions than in apologetics. First slide, please. Or next slide. Oh, I forgot I had that one. Next, yeah, right there. Thank you. Can you turn that back on? That's why I couldn't tell. I just did shut itself off again, Aaron. Francis Schaeffer, good author, if you haven't ever read him. He's dead now, but he was alive most of my lifetime, and just recently that he died here just a few years ago. I think it was his first book was called Escape from Reason. He was one of the first theologians in modern times here to show how devious people began to methodically redefine the nature of evidence and reality that can and cannot be used in an argument or in a proof. This onslaught against Christianity has taken place over the past several hundred years. Schaeffer illustrates his point by showing the divided reality created by those wishing to destroy Christianity. Next slide, please. So, Here we see what Schaeffer defines as the upper and the lower. What has happened over the past several centuries is that the spiritual world and the natural world have been divided early on, simply divided, and then as time went on, in the what you could call the more logical thinkers is the upper part there of theology and morality became private, became subjective, became relative, and then finally was just taken away. And next slide, that's kind of what that shows here in this second slide. These are a couple of slides from his book. Here we see what Schaeffer defines as the upper and the lower. What has happened over the past centuries is that the spiritual world and the natural world have become divided. These two realms became so separated by modern scientific thought that the upper was declared non-rational. Therefore, the only things that can be real and provable are on the lower level, on the empirical level, on the natural level, sometimes they call it. They have to be able to be verified. We'll talk about more about that in just a second. Over time, Schaeffer traces how the spiritual and upper world was finally taken away altogether, so that all that is left is the natural world. The upper no longer exists. In this kind of system, only empirical evidence can be considered. That's the kind of evidence that you get from the five senses that you learned when you were in school. You can see it, you can smell it, you can taste it, etc. Therefore, anything spiritual has been erased as if it never existed. So you can be talking to someone and think that they're on your same level, but they don't even think that what you think is important even exists. And that is a large portion of society today, whether they know it or not. And any conclusion that involves a spiritual explanation cannot even be considered. Alfred Ayer was a philosopher. He died, 20 years ago or so. I had to read his book called Language, Truth, and Logic when I was in college. He's perhaps best known for advocating what's called the verification principle, the idea that statements and questions are meaningful only if we can determine whether they are true by analytic or empirical methods. In other words, I can see it, I know that has to be there. Okay? That's an empirical proof. It's here right now. I walk out of the room, I can't prove it's there. In that book, Language, Truth, and Logic, according to the logical positives, as he called them, every true statement is either logical truth or statement of fact. But moral judgments, however, do not fit into either of these categories. Therefore, like Schaeffer points out, the modern thinker will not even consider spiritual things to be truth or fact. They do not fit into the web of rules that have been formulated by scientists and philosophers in the past 100 years. They've taken that arsenal away. It no longer exists in their realm. So when you're talking to them, it's like, what was this does not compute? I forgot what that came from. Anybody remember? I guess I am old. One of my philosopher instructors taught that Alfred Ayer would say, would put it this way. He gave an example. I still remember this. If you tell me that this totem pole is your God, then I can investigate it with my five senses, because I can see it and I can touch it, etc. But if you tell me that your God is something non-physical, then I cannot even give it consideration, because my five senses cannot experience it. This is the present state of much of the philosophy and science investigation in the world, and why God is not even considered. Slide, please. So, in 1966, Ayer wrote before this, if I remember right. But anyway, by 1966, Time magazine asked the question, is God dead? It was kind of important at the time for those of us that were alive. And then in 2017, just a few years ago, they went a step further and asked the same question, basically, that Pilate asked Jesus. Next slide. Is truth dead? Pilate stood right in front of Jesus and said, what is truth? And he had truth standing right in front of him. That's an important statement in the Bible that we often miss. Correct answers can never be guaranteed if the nature of the evidence that leads to the truth is limited. All right, one more time. Correct answers can never be guaranteed if the nature of the nature of the evidence that leads to the truth is limited. And that's what they've tried to do, is limit our arsenal of evidence, or at least sway it because of bias. But luckily for us, as we talked about before, God created a world in such a way that he shows, slide, his eternal power and deity. A world that demonstrates how invisible things are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made. There's our apologetics right there. God purposely left mountains of evidence both inside the Bible and outside in the universe itself, as we've already discussed, to point to the truth. Therefore, what we see in the evidence all around us are things that are not easily explained without an outside intelligence being involved, an intelligence that has capabilities far beyond that of man. We have already discussed places where we've seen this sort of things. We talked about the external or outside evidence of lack of transitional forms and symbiotic relationships and irreducible complexity and the laws of physics and some of the other kinds of scientific laws that are broken under a random chance belief system. And then we mentioned the irrational idea that evidence developed accidentally from non-intelligence through random acts of chemistry and electricity are just absurd. Note, these things are not spiritual, though. The things that we talked about are physical. So we're using physical facts to point towards a proof, at least not positive proof, but at least enough mountains of evidence. We're using physical things to show that spiritual must exist. If we do this correctly, we're using their own arsenal against them. That's what I'm trying to say. They're physical evidence. They are of the natural world, and yet guys like George Wald, the scientist that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, he put it, we have no other choice than to believe the impossible on philosophical grounds. Even though they know it can't work, their philosophy says it's got to work, so they keep with it and they keep tweaking it until hopefully it makes more sense. And it's the reason why they call it a theory to this day. Then we said that there is also mountains of internal evidence, which we're going to spend the rest of our time on in the next few weeks on this class. Evidence that God has placed within the words that he dictated. One of these, of course, we've mentioned a lot of times here, is the prophecies about Jesus, hundreds and hundreds of them. The odds are overwhelmingly against this happening without some kind of inside information. I don't know what I was doing there. Physical information that the evidence points towards a supernatural explanation. Someone outside of space and time who knows how things play out in the future. But as Schaeffer discusses over and over again in his series of books, modern man changed the rules and believes that the supernatural can no longer be trusted and even or even considered as existing at all for any kind of rational investigation. And therefore, mainstream science must totally rely on the physical senses. The spiritual is not allowed. Peter Williams, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. Yeah, Peter Williams, trying to make sure I got enough time. I can't see that. What time is it? Somebody tell me. 20 after. I got plenty of time. All right. We watched this film a couple of weeks ago, and he explained how the names that are used in the first 5 books of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, show evidence that they were written by someone that knew things that they should not have been able to know by the way that the way that the names are used. Not by people far off and remote into the future, which is one of the things over and over again this all changed back in about the 1970s, 1980s. You started for a long time seeing, all the time I was growing up, you'd see movies that tried to replicate what Jesus did. Every Easter there was a mountain of those. And even though biblically they were not correct, they still made Jesus out to be a god of some kind, all right? But starting in the 1970s and 1980s, that really started to change. And if you wasn't aware of it at the time, and you haven't kept up with it since, you watch one, and what you see now are documentaries where they bring in these other gospels, and they bring in these other sources, and they make certain assumptions that make Jesus physical. Now, they used very, very creative and devious words. They do this on purpose to not offend a person that is a Christian, yet at the same time, what they're saying in these documentaries all the time basically points to the fact that Jesus wasn't any different than any other man, and he became Christ over time because of these reasons that when people started to do the church and that sort of thing, they forced it, and then he became Christ. All right? Watch them. I watched several. First time I saw one was back in the late 1970s, I think it was. It's called From Jesus to Christ. And that name was kind of suspicious to me. What do you mean, from Jesus to Christ? What they meant was he started out as a man, and eventually he was created into a god by men. That was what that title meant, and that's what that documentary was about. There's lots of those out there now. And they act like they're telling you the truth. Okay? According to modern scientific investigation, this kind of verification that Williams talks about is not possible. But because it is impossible, not because it is impossible, an impossible investigation, but because that side of the verification process, the upper, has been stripped from the investigative arsenal. Since the supernatural does not exist, there has to be some other explanation. And that's what you get nowadays, are all kinds of extracurricular explanations trying to wipe out the fact that there had to be some deity involved in the first place. But a comparison of the New Testament books to the Gnostic books that Williams was talking about reveals that the other Gospels are the ones lacking empirical evidence. When you look at it correctly, go back and watch that film if you're not sure what I mean. I think it's recorded two weeks ago. But since they fit the narrative of those who deny the spiritual world, they are presented as empirical evidence against the intelligent designer. Yet Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts use names found in the writings of the time. So, next slide, please. For instance, hello. There we go. He talked about ossuaries or bone boxes, and I wasn't sure whether or not everybody in here even knew what those were. I know some of you do. Back at that time, back at the time of Jesus, they would lay someone in a tomb, and when the body had rotted, then most often they would take, especially the poor, would take the bones that were left and put them in family boxes. It was easier to store. It's just what they did, okay? This is an ossuary that they found, or a place where they found a lot of ossuaries. And the names were on them, okay? So they've accumulated from the historical sources like Josephus and some of the other writers of the time, and from ossuary boxes, all the names at the time when Jesus would have lived. And that's what he was talking about when he categorized those. And then he also said that the same scientific study took and computerized all the names in the Bible, and they match. Not just in names, but in proportions. The Gnostic Gospels don't. Is that proof positive? No. Just another piece of evidence in our arsenal. See how this works? We can pick evidence from a lot of different places. We're going to talk about the odds of that happening here in another week or so. And I want to get, a couple more things. We're going to watch another film today. I'll take just a second to get through this. Peter Williams goes on in that same video to talk, we didn't cover the whole video, but he talks about this same thing in geography and in history and archaeology and social customs. Those guys had to know what was going on. They didn't write 250 years later like they're trying to tell us. They wrote at the time when these things happened, or they wouldn't have known those things. It would have been impossible. They had first-hand knowledge. In and of itself, they had first-hand knowledge, and first-hand knowledge in and of itself is evidence, and it's physical evidence. God sprinkled this for evidence, as we said before, like breadcrumbs everywhere around the universe, so to speak, inside the Bible and outside the Bible, in so many places, in order to make himself known. Today we're going to watch, it's about 19 minutes long, I think, a video also by Peter Williams. It's called, Can the Old Testament Be Trusted Historically? Now this is going to be one example from the Old Testament, and then we're going to hit this hard next week with some other kinds of examples, but I thought this was good enough. It's pretty good, but you're going to have to follow. He's going to talk a little bit about the King James being translated 400 years ago, and that modern archaeology basically started about 200 years ago, and make a comparison as to how could the Bible have known back then when we didn't have the archaeology when it was written, and it still matches. Another kind of evidence. Yeah. Yes?
Can you tell me what the scripture that says about the box there and something? 56, 57, and 64. Thank you.
I don't remember. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, for this. Okay, this is Caiaphas's ossuary is in this bunch. They also think they found Jesus' brother James, but I've heard that that's still in debate right now, so I wasn't going to bring it up, because it says something like James, the father, the son of James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, or something on it. But they don't know whether or not that's a hoax or not yet, so it's not one I really want to go out and point to until I know more about it. Anyway, go ahead and start the video.
The term does not confuse from the TV show Lost in Space.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to relax back here, push my neck back against. And you guys watch. This will be the end.
What we're going to ask now is the question, can the Old Testament be trusted historically? I want to begin with a page. What do you think the page is of? Well, it's an old Bible. It's in fact a 400-year-old page of Bible. It's from the original King James Version, translation of 1611. It's a bit too small to read, so let's blow it up and make it bigger. In fact, let's make it even bigger. This comes from 2 Kings chapter 18. And what I want us to do is to read some of this together. By the way, what you'll see is that some of the shapes of letters are a bit different from what we're used to now. There is this thing that looks like a very tall C, which is in fact an S. But let's try and read it. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. Fenced means walled or fortified. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria to Lachish, saying, I have offended, I've done something wrong. Return from me, that means please go away. That which thou puttest on me will I bear, which means however much you fine me, I will pay. And the king of Assyria appointed unto Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Doesn't mean he gave it, he said, this is the fine. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house. Then just 2 verses later, and the king of Assyria sent Tartan and Rabsaris and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a great host, that means a great army, against Jerusalem. And they went up and came to Jerusalem. And when they were come up, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is in the highway of the fuller's field. This is someone who washes clothes. Why would I bring this to you? Well, it's a passage which was printed over 400 years ago, but it contains some particular historical claims. Particularly, it says there was a Judean king called Hezekiah, that all of the fortified cities of Judah were captured, all except for Jerusalem. That's what's clear in the passage, and that this was done by an Assyrian king called Sennacherib. That Sennacherib is particularly associated with a place called Lachish, and the rest of the passage will say that he fought against Lachish, and that he fined Hezekiah 30 talents of gold and 300 talents of silver. So these are the claims that we have within the text. And when we look at those, we find that they correlate rather remarkably with things that are known from history. But what we find is that, according to the text, whereas Sennacherib fines Hezekiah 30 talents of gold and 300 talents of silver, Hezekiah in fact gave all of the silver that was in his house, his palace, and in the temple. Why is he fined 30 and 300 and then gives all? Is it because all of the silver in his house and in the temple corresponded exactly to 300 talents of silver? Well, I want us to think about a man who became rather famous for conquering large parts of the world called Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte is said to be the person who began archaeology. He took experts round with him in his army, and that was around 200 years ago when he went to Egypt. That was the first time that people actually dug things systematically out of the ground. That means that our printed Bible is from 400 years ago, but archaeology didn't begin till 200 years ago. We then ask the question, if the printed Bible was produced without any knowledge of archaeology, that means all knowledge that is contained in that printed Bible can only have come through having been handed down from generation to generation in manuscripts. We then ask the question, how many of the things that they thought were the case have come to be confirmed by archaeology? What we find is that there are a whole number of Assyrian kings mentioned in the Bible. And I could name a number of them. We have figures such as Tiglath-Pileser III. And what happened is, after archaeology began, in the 1840s, that was when Assyrian was deciphered. They then find Tiglath-Pileser III's own monuments, and they find that he is a real figure and at the right historical time. Or you could look at other Assyrian kings. There are, in fact, a series of 5 Assyrian kings mentioned in the Old Testament. People like Shalmaneser V, or we find that 4 of them are mentioned in a very specific order. One of them, Sargon, is mentioned in the book of Isaiah, and you can't be precisely sure where he fits in with the rest, but he more or less fits in the right place. But also Sennacherib we find mentioned in the passage we've looked at, and then later Esarhaddon. So we find them. Now, why would I use this authoritative source of Wikipedia? The reason I use that is because Wikipedia was founded by an atheist, and I think it's very useful on all sorts of things, like if you want to find out about a place you're going to visit. On the other hand, on certain key things, such as the Bible, I find it to be less reliable, because I find it to be somewhat geared towards skepticism. Therefore, when we have the agreement that something in the Bible is true, it is because people have seen that there's such an overwhelming level of evidence they've had to concede that it is true. So we have 5 Assyrian kings, basically in the same order as they are mentioned in the Bible. So this is a really striking fact. But it's not just that we have kings from other countries mentioned in the Bible, we also have kings from the Bible mentioned in the records of other countries after archaeology begins. So we find many kings of Israel and of Judah are mentioned by these Assyrian kings too. You could come to the British Museum, a very grand building in London where we have all sorts of stolen goods from the time before we lost our empire. And within those rooms you can find the cartoons which Sennacherib had on his palace walls. These were pictures of how he had defeated people. And you will find scene after scene. Here we have shields with people hiding behind them with arrows. And we have, of course, because they didn't have the technology to animate, the scenes run through like this. Down at the bottom we have 3 people, Jewish people from Lachish, who are being impaled. This is a picture of a city being sieged up there. That what he does is he portrays how he defeated Lachish. We also, there are 3 copies of this prism, and this tells, in Sennacherib's own words, what happened. This is what he says. As for Hezekiah the Judean, I besieged 46 of his fortified, walled cities. Notice that phrase, almost the same as the one in the Bible, fenced or walled cities. I conquered them and took out 200,150 people. He himself I locked up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. Now this is what is called spin, putting a positive light on something. You see, he didn't actually conquer the city, but how can you say, I didn't conquer the city? Respectably, you say, I shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Ah, but Sennacherib, you didn't get into the cage, did you? Hezekiah was overwhelmed by the splendor of my lordliness, and he sent me 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver. Now you remember in the Bible, it was 30 talents of gold, and 300 talents of silver was the fine. But then Hezekiah gave all of the silver that was in his house and in the temple. Now, I find the agreement on the number of talents of gold an amazing, striking thing. And I find that far more striking than the disagreement on the amount of silver. Now, you could explain the differences on the amount of silver by saying that either text A or text B has a copying error, or that one of them is wrong and is exaggerating or diminishing, or that they are talking about slightly different things. One is talking about the amount of the fine, the other is talking about the amount that was actually given. Those are all possible. But the thing that I find really striking is that we have this text which says in the Bible, 30 talents of gold was the fine, and then after archaeology begins, and then Assyrian is deciphered, an account correlating to exactly that. Now, I don't know of other historical records where a detail as precise as that has been confirmed by archaeology over that period of time. We again remember this verse which talks about Tartan and Rabsaris. Now in Hebrew, Tartan is spelt with a short A, tar, and then a long A, tan. And that's the way it's been preserved in Hebrew. Then what happens is people decipher Assyrian or Akkadian. And there's a big long dictionary. This is the Assyrian dictionary made in Chicago, and you can see that there's one volume just for T. There's also another volume just for T with a dot underneath. But if we just take the concise version of this, there's something actually made in Cambridge, the Concise Dictionary of Akkadian, you can see that it says Tartanu means second in command. So even the vowel length is exactly the same, that they have preserved this and it's been deciphered and it's found to be the case. Or when it says later, or in another volume, that Rab is the word for a chief or overseer. It's a bit like our word rabbi. One of the things you find is this, that the Bible has correctly handed down Assyrian words, even though the scribes who handed down the Bible almost certainly didn't know Assyrian because it was a defunct language. And handing down correctly the phonetics of words in languages that no one speaks anymore is actually a very impressive feat. Or another detail you have in the Bible, that Hezekiah did waterworks. He made a pool, he made a conduit for water and brought water into the city. Again, something which subsequent archaeology, discovery of the Siloam Tunnel, has been rather interested in. Now, if we take a Bible from between about the year 1700 and the year 1800, we find that commonly they began to put dates in the margins. Here is a Bible from 1785. And we see that when it dates the fall of Samaria to the Assyrians, it says that it happened before Christ in the year 721. When we look at what has been thought after archaeology began, we actually find in Wikipedia that it says that it believes this happened around 722. Well, what is so surprising? The King James Version and other versions that were produced in Europe were produced on the basis of Hebrew editions. One of the main Hebrew editions was made in 1525. But the earliest manuscripts available for that Hebrew edition were from no earlier than the year 1100. And then we find that their information has been handed down to 1100 AD or later from around the year 700 BC. So in other words, we're talking about 1800 years of being transmitted through manuscripts. And we're finding highly accurate information. The Assyrian kings' names are spelt correctly. So what we could say is I could go to an ignorant monk sitting in his cell somewhere in the Middle Ages, before the Reformation, before the Renaissance, copying a Latin Bible. And I could say, tell me the names of the Assyrian kings. And he would look in his Latin Bible and he would give you a fairly accurate rendering of their names. I would say, tell me, O monk, when did those kings live? And he would do his sums and would give me a rough date for when they lived, which would basically be correct. So how can that monk, sitting in isolation in his cell and copying out Latin Bible manuscripts, correctly have information, historical information, from so much earlier? This is an amazing thing and shows that what we have through the Bible is something that has been trusted, and that trust has been vindicated. But I want to ask a question. What's the most advanced? Is it the ancient Babylonian clay tablet? Or is it the leather writing of that medieval monk? Or is it a modern phone? Well, we might think that the most advanced is the one on the left. It seems to have the ability to send information round the globe so much more quickly. This seems the least advanced. It's chunky. It's got 600 signs. It's so complicated. This is lighter, and you have fewer letters. Perhaps this is more advanced than that, but that's the most advanced on the left. But then you ask the question, which lasts the longest? Well, how many of you are using a mobile phone that you had 5 years ago? One person. Well, do take pity on that person. What we find is they don't last very long. Hard disks don't last very long. But we know that books, paper, can last for hundreds of years. Leather can last for hundreds of years. And we know that clay tablets can last for thousands of years. But then you ask yourself the question, what contains the oldest text? Actually, the oldest text could be on your phone. This could be a late Babylonian tablet. You could have the text from an old Babylonian tablet on your phone. So what we've got to recognize is that the Bible has come to us through a culture where they had an advanced writing system. It was to write on perishable material such as papyrus or leather. And we know that not just because it's perished, but also because we have leather preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls in jars, or because we have the fiber marks from papyrus on the back of seals that were put on letters. We know they wrote on perishable material that does not survive except in extraordinary circumstances. But as a result of that, we might think that that means the text is young. But in fact, the text can be very, very old on that material. It can be just as old as the things on the clay tablets. So whereas we can go and see clay tablets in museums and think, wow, that's old, we can't see Bibles that seem to be quite that old in museums. And so some people think that means the Bible is young. But that's simply committing a basic fallacy about the material that people wrote on. I would want to suggest that the Old Testament, when they wrote on perishable material using a 22-letter alphabet, was actually a very advanced thing to do at the time. And we have to remember that the whole of our society is built on copying. When we hear someone's voice on the phone, we don't actually hear their voice, we hear a copy of their voice. In fact, a copy of a copy of their voice. In fact, a copy of their voice many, many times repeated before it got to you. Every file we download is a copy. Everything that we see on TV is a copy. We have great, great confidence in copying in our society. Now, people say, couldn't someone have miscopied the Bible? I want to put it like this. We know that it's technically possible that you could be watching a sports match on your TV and someone could have falsified the image that you saw. They have computer generation where they could make it so you're seeing something completely different from what your neighbour is seeing. That is possible. But the reason we think they're not doing that is we know that they would need a very big budget in order to get enough programmers to do that. But it's exactly the same with miscopying the Bible. You see, it takes about a year to write a Bible out. That's a big investment of time. If you write a Bible on leather, think how many animals you have to kill to have the number of animal skins you need for a Bible. It is big budget business. And so actually the economics of it suggests that this is not what's happened. The most natural belief is simply that it's a copying culture where they hand things down. You remember in the days of Jesus, there were many scribes. It was their job to hand things down. There have always been scribes in a culture like that. And what we see when we look at a passage like 2 Kings chapter 18 is really, really precise information that has been handed down over thousands of years with utter accuracy. Now, we cannot prove everything in the Bible to be historically true. If we only believed it if we had corroboration for each part of it, we would not be believing it. If I said to my wife, she said she's been for a walk, I say, can you prove that? I'm saying, I don't trust you. Actually, I can prove many things that my wife claims, but many other things I simply trust her word for it. Similarly with the Bible, there are some things that have really been shown to have been handed down over a long period of time, and there are many things that have not been shown that way, but it is rational to trust that they've been handed down. It's one thing to prove something to be historically true. I'm not saying I can prove it to be historically true. I'm saying it is very rational to trust and believe that it's historically true. Thank you very much for listening.